The first thing he noticed wasn't the woman slipping toward the door with her head down. It was the little girl, small enough that her feet didn't reach the chair's edge, quiet enough that the room's laughter swallowed her presence. Her eyes weren't on the exit like her mother's. They were fixed on his plate, on the untouched bread, the warm food, the simple proof that someone here had more than enough. And the way she stared wasn't greedy. It was careful, almost apologetic, like hunger itself had taught her manners. If you believe in kindness and second chances, take a moment right now to like this video, comment, share it, and subscribe to the channel. Because stories like this only spread when good hearts push them forward. He sat frozen in the glow of restaurant lights that made everything look softer than real life. Outside, the city moved like it always did, indifferent and fast. Inside, he had been trying to convince himself that he was fine, that this dinner was just another stop in a long day, another receipt, another routine, another routine. His suit still held the shape of success, but his chest carried the weight of something heavier than any fabric could hide. He had built a life that looked complete from a distance, work that paid well, a home that stayed quiet, a schedule that stayed full, but no one could see the part of him that had been hollowed out over the years. He had learned to keep grief behind polite smiles, to keep loneliness behind productivity, to keep his pain so neatly folded that even he sometimes forgot it was there. Tonight was supposed to be a reward, a promotion, a victory. He had sat down alone, ordered too much, like people do when they want to feel surrounded by abundance, and stared at the steam rising from food he didn't really want. His phone had lit up a dozen times with congratulatory messages from colleagues who would never know his real life. He hadn't replied to anyone. He had been listening to the clink of cutlery and the murmur of conversations around him, trying to pretend that the world still held something warm for him. And then, in the corner of his vision, he saw movement that didn't match the rhythm of the room. A woman in a plain coat, hair pulled back like she didn't have time for it, guiding a little girl with a gentle hand on her shoulder. They weren't loud. They weren't messy. They weren't the kind of people anyone would notice, unless they were looking for them. But he was looking now, because the little girl's gaze had landed on his plate with a kind of silent intensity that made his throat tighten. The woman's face was turned downward, as if she could shrink into invisibility by refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The little girl's face was pale under the warm lights. There was a softness to her cheeks that suggested she should have been laughing somewhere, maybe with a smear of sauce at the corner of her mouth, maybe with a childish complaint about vegetables. Instead, she looked like a child who had learned how to be quiet in public, how to take up as little space as possible. She looked like someone who had seen too many closed doors. He watched as the woman tried to angle them past tables without drawing attention, moving with that specific carefulness of someone who already expects refusal. It hit him then. She wasn't leaving from a meal. She was leaving from an attempt. An attempt to ask for something. An attempt that had failed. His eyes followed them to the host stand, where an employee leaned forward, speaking with the polite firmness people use when they've repeated the same boundary all day. The woman nodded, still not looking up, and guided the girl toward the door. The girl turned her head slightly as they passed his table, and her eyes flicked one more time to his plate. Not jealous, not demanding, just longing. Like she was memorizing what comfort looked like. Something in him snapped, not in anger, but in recognition. He knew what it felt like to be hungry for something you couldn't name. He knew what it felt like to want and not know how to ask. For years, after the accident, his life had become a series of quiet departures, quietly leaving rooms where people talked about their families, quietly leaving gatherings when someone asked if he was doing better now, quietly leaving his own house every morning because the silence inside it was louder than traffic. He had become an expert in leaving without being noticed. But watching that woman and child, he felt the difference between choosing to leave and being pushed out. He stood up so quickly, his chair scraped the floor. A few people glanced over, then looked away. He didn't care. He didn't think about what he would say. He didn't even think about his pride. He only knew that the girl's eyes had done something his success hadn't managed to do in years. They had made him feel. He moved toward the door, not rushing, but with purpose, like a man walking toward a decision that had been waiting for him a long time. The woman had reached the entrance now. The cold outside pressed against the glass, and city lights shimmered on wet pavement. She paused as if gathering courage to step back into the night with nothing. The little girl clutched her hand, her other hand, holding a small, worn backpack. The child's shoulders were set in that small, brave posture children wear when they're trying not to disappoint the adults they love. He didn't stop them with force. He didn't grab an arm or block the doorway. He simply stepped close enough for the woman to notice, and for the first time, she lifted her eyes. They were exhausted eyes that had cried in private and then wiped the tears before anyone could see. Eyes that carried the shame society places on people who need help, as if poverty is a moral flaw. When she saw his suit, her face tightened, preparing for judgment. But he wasn't judging. He was remembering. He gestured back toward the table, not like a command, but like an invitation. The woman hesitated, her hand tightening around the little girl's. Her instincts told her to refuse, to keep moving, to avoid becoming a spectacle. He could see the fight inside her, the need versus the fear. The little girl looked up at her mother, then at him, then back at his plate, visible behind him. She didn't ask. She didn't plead. She just waited, because children learn quickly when pleading doesn't work. He walked back first, giving them space to choose without pressure. He sat down again, forcing his hands to be steady. He pushed his plate slightly away from himself, making room. He took a slow breath. He realized his heart was beating, like it used to before big meetings. Only this felt more important than any contract. When the woman finally approached, she moved like she was stepping into a place she didn't belong. She guided the girl into the chair opposite him, keeping herself half standing as if ready to bolt. He didn't smile too widely. He didn't speak like a savior. He just nodded toward the food and waited. The girl's eyes widened, not with excitement, but with disbelief, like she couldn't trust that permission was real. The woman's cheeks flushed, and her hands trembled at the edges of her coat. She looked like someone trying to hold herself together with sheer willpower. He could tell she wanted to apologize, to explain, to make herself smaller, to justify her existence in a world that demanded receipts for compassion. But he didn't demand explanations. He had once been the man who thought people should handle their problems quietly. Life had taught him that some problems crush you no matter how strong you are. The little girl reached for the bread first, not grabbing, just touching it gently, as if checking whether it would disappear if she moved too fast. She took a bite, and her whole face changed. The tension in her jaw loosened. Her eyes softened. In that small moment, the room around them seemed to fade, and all that remained was the simple human truth of someone finally eating. He looked down at the table, and his vision blurred. He blinked hard. It wasn't just the child's hunger. It was the memory of his own emptiness. After he lost his wife and unborn son in one terrible night, he had stopped eating properly for months. Friends had brought food that went cold on his counter. He had stared at plates the way the girl stared at his. Like comfort was something meant for other people. Hunger came in many forms, and he had lived with one that no meal could fix. The woman finally sat, though her posture remained cautious. She watched her daughter eat with a mix of relief and pain, like a mother who would rather starve than let her child go without. but who had reached the end of what sacrifice could cover. The girl ate slowly, savoring, careful not to spill, careful not to be too much. It broke something in him that she had to be careful while eating. As the minutes passed, he noticed details that told a story the woman wasn't speaking out loud. The girl's sleeves were a little short. The backpack's zipper was missing a tab. The woman's hands were rough, nails clean, but worn. The hands of someone who worked hard in jobs that didn't care about dignity. There was a faint bruise near her wrist, the kind you get from carrying heavy bags or gripping railings on crowded buses. And yet, despite everything, the woman kept smoothing her daughter's hair, tucking a strand behind her ear, as if to remind the world that this child was loved. He didn't ask questions at first. He let the food do what food does when kindness is behind it. It softened fear. And as fear softened, the woman's face loosened too. Her shoulders lowered a fraction. She stopped scanning the room for judgment. She began to breathe like she might survive the night. Eventually, in the quiet between bites, she spoke in fragments, enough for him to understand, not enough to feel like interrogation. A job lost when the store closed, rent rising faster than her savings. A landlord who didn't care that she was trying. A temporary couch that became an awkward burden. A shelter that was full. A list of resources that were just phone numbers that didn't answer. She hadn't come here to steal. She had come because her daughter had smelled food from the street, and she had made the mistake of hoping. He listened with a stillness that surprised him. He had been surrounded by boardrooms where people talked about market shifts and strategic layoffs, like those words were clean. Sitting here, he could see the human cost of those clean words in the hollow of a mother's eyes. He didn't offer grand promises. He didn't throw cash on the table like a dramatic gesture. He did something quieter and, in some ways, braver. He admitted that he knew what it was like to lose everything that made you feel safe. He let his own grief show in his softened gaze. He told her, simply, that he didn't want them to step back into the cold without a plan. That was how change began for him. Not like a movie miracle, but like a slow door opening. He paid for the meal, but also asked the restaurant manager about local organizations that could help immediately, not just sometime. He used the same persistence he used at work, except now it wasn't for profit. It was for people. He called numbers until someone picked up. He arranged a night at a small family shelter that had one opening, because someone had canceled. He offered a ride, but when the woman hesitated, he ordered a ride share and sent it to the door, so she didn't have to feel trapped in a stranger's car. Before they left, the little girl looked at him again. This time, she didn't stare at his plate. She stared at his face, like she was trying to understand why a man with so much would notice someone with so little. She held the bread in both hands and took a final bite, then wiped her mouth with the back of her sleeve and sat up straighter. It was a small shift, but it felt like watching a flower lift towards sunlight. That night, after they were safely inside the shelter, he returned to his quiet house. The silence was still there, but it sounded different. It didn't feel like punishment. It felt like space. Space where something new could exist. He stood in his kitchen and realized his promotion meant nothing compared to the fact that a child had eaten because he chose to look up from his own sadness. In the weeks that followed, he couldn't forget them. He tried to go back to routine, but his routine now felt like a lie. He started showing up again, not as a rescuer, but as a steady presence. He helped the woman fill out forms that always felt designed to exhaust you. He asked his company's HR department about emergency assistance programs, not for himself, but because he learned that sometimes help exists behind the right desk if you ask hard enough. He connected her with a job training center, and when she got an interview, he arranged childcare. He did these things quietly, without announcing them. because he understood that dignity is part of survival, and in doing so, he found himself coping with his own pain in a way he never had. He had tried therapy once and stopped when it got too raw. He had tried traveling and found that beaches couldn't outshine grief. He had tried working harder and discovered success doesn't hug you back. But showing up for someone else didn't erase his loss. It gave it somewhere to rest. His suffering began to transform, slowly, into something that didn't just hurt. It began to mean. One afternoon, months later, he saw the woman again in daylight, outside a small community office. Her hair was still pulled back, but it looked less like surrender and more like focus. There was color in her cheeks. She held paperwork with the careful pride of someone building a new foundation. The little girl was beside her, a little taller now, wearing a jacket that fit. She clutched a library book to her chest, like a treasure. When she saw him, she didn't look at his hands or his clothes. She smiled with her whole face, unburdened. He realized then that the story hadn't just changed their lives. It had changed his for the first time since the accident. He felt something like belonging. Not because the pain was gone, but because it no longer trapped him in isolation. He had been living like a man who survived, but not like a man who was alive. These small acts, calls made, rides arranged, meals shared, had stitched something back together in him. On the anniversary of his loss, he visited the cemetery, as he always did, bringing flowers and standing in the quiet. But this time, he didn't feel like he was walking back into darkness. He whispered a promise, not to move on, because some love never moves on, but to move forward carrying it. He left the cemetery and drove to a volunteer center where families lined up for food and resources. He didn't do it to distract himself. He did it because he finally understood that love can keep live in what you give. Near the end of that year, he sat at the same restaurant again, not in his old loneliness, but with a gentle warmth in his chest. He didn't come to celebrate a promotion. He came because he had made it a habit to sponsor meals there for families who needed them. He spoke with the manager about a simple system, no public announcements, no humiliating questions, just quiet vouchers provided through local shelters. The manager agreed, grateful for a kindness that didn't demand applause. And then, as if the universe wanted to close the circle softly, the door opened, and a small figure walked in, holding her mother's hand. The woman looked different now, still tired, because life doesn't suddenly become easy, but steadier, like someone who had climbed out of a deep hole and learned how to keep climbing. The little girl's hair was neatly braided. She wore shoes that didn't look worn down. She held her mother's hand with confidence, not fear. They spotted him. The woman's eyes filled slightly, and she gave him a nod that carried more gratitude than words ever could. The little girl didn't stare at anyone's plate this time. She didn't have to. She walked up to his table and placed something small beside his napkin. A simple drawing on folded paper, made with crayons. It showed 3 stick figures under a bright yellow sun. One was tall in a suit. One was a woman with long hair. One was a little girl with a big smile. Above them, in messy letters, it said, "Thank you for seeing me." He held the paper carefully, like it was fragile gold. He realized he had spent years believing he was the one who needed saving from grief, when what he needed was purpose. Not a grand purpose that makes headlines, but a human purpose. The kind that begins when you choose to see someone who feels invisible. Before the story fully ends, leave a comment right now telling me, have you ever had a moment where one small act of kindness changed everything for you? Or someone you love? Hi. He looked around the restaurant, at the warm lights, the ordinary people, the clinking cutlery. The world hadn't become perfect. Poverty still existed outside those doors. Grief still lived inside him. But now, hope lived there too. And hope, he realized, doesn't arrive like a miracle. It arrives like a choice. Again and again, until it becomes a life. If this story touched your heart even a little, please like the video. Share it with someone who needs hope today. And comment what you felt in that moment when the little girl stopped staring at the plate and started smiling. Your engagement helps these stories reach the people who are still waiting for someone to see them.